Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Aleena Khan, a healthcare operator with 10 years of experience at two health systems, Optum, and a early stage startup. I am thrilled to be moderating today's conversation because I know firsthand how crucial it is for health systems to continuously innovate and not only improve the way that healthcare is delivered, but to also operate more efficiently. Joining us today are two industry experts who will share both strategic and tactical tips on how to build relationships with, this is important, and ultimately sell to health systems. On one hand, we've got Rachel Tornheim with deep experience working at health systems, and I suspect a lot of experience being sold too. And then on the other hand, we've got Joe Ferrara, who has extensive experience selling to health systems. Just to ground us in today's conversation, the format will start with a structured interview. We'll save some time at the end for questions. By the way, thank you to everyone who shared some really terrific questions in advance. Don't hesitate to ask more using the Q&A function at any point during this conversation. If we don't get to them today, I encourage you to follow up with any of us offline. Sound good, folks? All right. Let's get started with some introduction. Rachel, can you please tell us about your background, particularly your experience at Mount Sinai?
Absolutely. So the foundation of my career is I have a consulting background as well as an MBA. And then I've spent the last 14 years working in different aspects of the healthcare industry in New York City. So I've worked at two health startups, two health systems, and one payer. So seen the industry from all different sides. I've worked in value-based care and clinical decision support and digital health. Most recently, I've been at Mount Sinai for the last 3 years, where I'm head of consumer digital innovation. This is an in-house startup within the health system tasked with building patient engagement software. And so in that role, I've dealt with vendors in different capacities. The team is actually being phased out, and so I'm going to be transitioning back to the startup space and working as an advisor to some startups.
Wonderful, a wealth of experience. Thanks, Rachel. Joe, can you tell us about your background selling to health systems as well as your current role?
Of course. Thank you, Alina. So I have 7 years experience selling to health systems. Most recently, I served as the Senior Director of Sales and Customer Service for a life sciences startup, selling mostly to academic medical centers throughout the United States. Currently, I'm the founding customer service lead at Pharmacist Healthcare Dashboards, or PhD, which is a pharmacy startup. I'm also an advisor at Lightit, and I serve as a consultant for early stage startups, mostly looking to get their first sales and kind of build their products.
Fantastic. So it sounds like with the both of you here today, we're going to be able to talk about things from both angles. But I'd like to start with the big picture. Rachel, for folks who haven't worked at a health system, can you paint that picture of how these organizations look and how they operate?
Absolutely. So, basics of health systems. First of all, these are large organizations. So, even a single location hospital probably has around 10,000 employees. A multi location hospital like Mount Sinai or New York Presbyterian, 40 to 50,000, and a really big one like a Northwell Health, 80 to 100,000 people. So, this means that they're going to tend to be bureaucratic organizations, right? There's just a lot of different departments and people, and unlike at a small startup where everyone knows each other, that's not the case at a big health system. So if you have to navigate a sale and you're dealing with your champion and legal and procurement, those people don't necessarily know each other, which can contribute to it taking a long time to get through. Second thing about health systems, they tend to be old organizations. So a lot of them have been around for over a century. Implications of that, they probably have fairly established processes that they've been using for decades for procurement, for evaluation, that kind of thing. And so they're more likely to be a bit set in their ways and have templates that they're going to want to default to. Third thing about health systems, this is not a high margin industry. So hospitals usually have, if they have positive revenue at all, they have single digit margins. And as a result of that, they're pretty critical of spending money on new applications, on new vendors, right? So you really need to prove a compelling ROI to get them to carve out money in their budget. Fourth thing is that they're highly regulated. So, of course, we know healthcare in general is highly regulated. Health systems in particular, one of the few pieces of the industry I'm aware of where the auditors frequently show up in person unannounced to do audits, right? So as a Mount Sinai employee, I frequently get emails that say the Department of Health is on site, Joint Commission is on site. And so that breeds a culture of risk aversion, right? You don't want to try something experimental if your auditors could come in tomorrow and have an issue with it. And the other piece of the culture that that contributes to is a culture of consensus. So I've noticed when trying to propose new ideas, people in health systems often want to check with a lot of other people, sort of related to the culture of bureaucracy, and that can also contribute to things taking a long time.
Thank you. That's a really helpful description and very spot on. Now, in your work at Mount Sinai, I have this sneaking suspicion you've come across a lot of vendors. How have you interacted with them?
Absolutely. I interact with vendors in three ways. The first is that they like to send me cold outreach to try to sell things to me, to the health system. I probably get maybe 2 to 3 dozen of these emails or LinkedIn messages a week. Right now, it dominates my inbox. So that's way number one. Number two, in my role leading the consumer digital innovations team, I've been involved in bringing some vendors and trying to bring some vendors in that our team wanted to use. And then third, as the health system is winding down the homegrown platform that my team had built, they're replacing it with vendor provided solutions. And so I've been working with some of those vendors as part of the transition project.
Got it. So I guess when vendors reach out to you, do you ever actually respond?
Sometimes, sometimes. It depends on a number of factors. I'd say most of the time, no. The times when I do, it's because if they reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'm much more likely to be responsive versus if they're pinging my work email, which I didn't give them, and I'm not in my work email to engage with vendors. I'm there to do my job. Second factor is if the solution they're reaching out about has any relevance to me. Is it of interest to me, right? So if it's something about digital health, something about AI, I'm interested in learning about those spaces, and so I'm more likely to respond. In the last week, I had vendors reach out to me looking to sell marketing services, employee engagement services, nursing recruitment services, and I just got one yesterday on parking services. And given that I don't work in marketing or HR or facilities management, I'm not going to respond to any of those, right? Because the people who are reaching out clearly didn't even look up my background to figure out if I was relevant to their offerings. The next factor that affects if I respond is kind of what the person asks for when they outreach. I find most vendors, when they reach out, they're immediately giving a pitch. They're saying, we have this solution, it solves this problem. Are you interested? And usually the answer is no. But a way that vendors can increase the likelihood that I engage is if instead they ask for my feedback, they ask for my advice, right? So if they say something like, I see you have a lot of experience in digital health. We've developed a solution that helps address this particular problem. Would love to get your feedback on it. Do you have 20 minutes to chat? Then I'm more likely to engage with that versus if they're initially pushing a sale. And then the last factor is, do I have any sort of prior experience or prior connection with this person? Right? So have they engaged with me on LinkedIn? Have we met at a webinar or a conference? Have they gotten a warm intro from a mutual connection? I'm more likely to respond there versus if it's a complete stranger.
Got it. That makes sense and takes us actually to the sales side of things. Joe, based on your experience, how do you identify the potential in conversations with contacts who aren't really direct decision makers? And what strategies do you use to nurture those into more meaningful connections?
That's a great question, Aleena. I think in my experience, it seems like the indirect approach ends up being the most direct. So I like to be open to having conversations with folks at all levels of the health system. And this is actually how I met Rachel. I originally posted on Health Tech Nerds, which is a Slack community, about the pharmacy startup that I'm working with and mentioned that we have a new solution and we'd like to connect with health systems, especially in the New York City area, since I'm based here. And Rachel responded and she said, I'm willing to see the demo. I'd like to see it and learn more. And but just want to let you know I'm going to be leaving the health system soon, and I may not necessarily be the right person for you to contact on this. And I said, no problem. We'd love to get your feedback. We want to share the demo, and we ended up sharing the demo with Rachel, and she saw that the merit in the system that we built, and she was able to connect us with a senior individual within the health system who turned out to be the right person to talk to. So it's really starting with a large health system as like Mount Sinai, as Rachel mentioned, with many thousands of employees, the odds of you finding the right person from the get-go are very slim. So I think it really pays to be open to these conversations and to see where they lead. And you never know what opportunities that may unlock for you.
Got it. So I'm hearing some themes. Take advantage of opportunities to connect, even if it's just for feedback. And just a friendly reminder, folks, feel free to add questions to the Q&A portion of our webinar. Now, Rachel, what advice would you give to companies who are looking to find their way into a large health system?
Yeah, so harkening back to some of what I said about what influences whether or not I respond, first is I really recommend reaching out to folks on LinkedIn. Try that as a first course of action. And even before sending a message, maybe try following someone, see if they're posting content on LinkedIn, if they are engaged with that content, right? You can sort of warm them up a little bit, increase the odds that they're going to accept a connection request. And from there, you can see if you can get them on a call. Second piece, I would echo Joe's advice about reaching a broad audience, and specifically from a seniority perspective, I think it's I think it's wise to try to start by talking to people who would be the users of whatever your platform is. So if it's something that nurses would use or doctors would use or case managers would use, those folks aren't going to be the decision maker on what vendor are we selecting and are we signing this contract. But those are the people who can validate whether the pain point that you address is something that they experience, and they may be able to connect you to a decision maker. So I would try to start a little more junior in the hierarchy. As I mentioned, I think it's always a good idea to ask for feedback. A wise man named Pitbull once said, ask for money, get advice, ask for advice, get money twice. And I think that's highly applicable to sales. I think it's really smart to ask for advice because you understand that if the person looks at your solution, hears your pitch, sees your demo, even if you haven't specifically asked them if they want to buy it, if they see value in it and they're interested in buying it, they will initiate that side of the discussion. So your goal is really just to get them on that call and get them to take a look. And then the last piece of advice is to try to attend industry events where people who are either going to be your user or going to be in that department are going to be there. And there's obviously really broad industry events, but try to narrow down. So like I was talking to a founder recently who has a product that helps with tracking of supplies within hospitals. And so we were able to identify an industry group that focuses on supply chains for health systems. And so that was where I advised him to go to try to make some connections.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's say you've got the initial call, right? What are some tips that you have for that first call, Rachel?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, do at least a little bit of research on the health system before you go into that call. So, like, at the very least, know what EHR they use, know if they've been in the news for anything recently, right? Are they opening a new location? Are they closing a location? Are they in a high profile lawsuit? Do they have a nursing strike, right? Just like know some high level facts about the health system. You want to very early on in your pitch present the strongest evidence you have that your solution works. Because remember, health systems are risk adverse, right? They don't want to be trailblazers. They don't want to try something that's untested. So if you've implemented in other health systems, great. If you haven't, if you at least have a pilot or some kind of study, that's going to be important to demonstrate. And then finally, you want to be really clear about your ROI. So because health systems are financially constrained, they're going to tend to be most excited about solutions that are going to help them financially, right? So things that'll save them money or maybe improve their revenue, although that's a harder case to make, doesn't mean they don't care about other things. They absolutely do care about patient quality, about patient experience, about clinician burnout, but you want to lead with the financial ROI if possible.
Got it. So come prepared, do your research, and also show that you have a clear ROI. Thank you for the pro tips. It sounds like it's also really important to understand your audience. So, Joe, can you talk to us about how you've customized your communication and sales tactics in a way that resonates with the health systems you've worked with?
Sure, there's a few ways. So number one is you always want to start with a really strong slide deck. Have that ready to go. Have your ROI in there. Have your clinical data, if there's any data that you've managed to collect with your company, with other customers that you're ready to share, and keep it really tight. It's got to be 7 to 10 slides max for the intro call. At least in my experience, this is what I've done. It always included an appendix at the end. So if there's a question that comes up that perhaps doesn't come up all the time, but it's on your radar. It's good to have it there, and you could always scroll down to that if it does come up organically. But it shows that you're prepared and you're ready to answer the question. So number two is, and this is super basic, but I think it shouldn't be overlooked. But don't waste time talking about solutions or products that are not relevant to your customer. So if you know a particular health system doesn't have a need for one of the services that you offer, just omit that and move on. And number three is keep it simple. I know there's a tendency, to want to say as much as you can, but it's better to keep it tight and short and leave time for questions. Because you really want your prospective customers to be able to engage and to think about this without throwing too much at them. And number four is you want to respect their time. So as Rachel mentioned, if you're asking for a 20-minute demo with the prospective customer, make sure you stick within the confines of that 20 minutes. You don't want to go on for 45 minutes or an hour because you don't want to waste their time, and you're also building trust by keeping your word. So you say, hey, I'm asking for 20 minutes of your time, and I'm going to respect those 20 minutes. And number five, and this is the last point, you want to make sure that you spend a lot of time asking questions and really find out what those pain points are, as Rachel mentioned. This is critical because you want to understand, first of all, is it a good fit? Is your solution, does this make sense for the customer? Are you a good fit for them? What are their pain points? What are they working on? How are they working to address those problems now? And this will give you an opportunity to come up with new ideas, new ways to help the customer, and ultimately serve them better. So I think it will make your proposal stronger in the end to have that knowledge. And you never know where that conversation is going to go. So I think that's probably the most important of the 5 points that I just mentioned.
Thank you. It sounds like really engaging in that conversation and coming in prepared sounds like really key themes here. Now, let's fast forward. Let's say a company has found a champion who is anxious to move forward with a contract. Rachel, what does that process typically look like?
Yeah. So first, just to level set, this is a process that's going to take a long time, right? You've got to buckle in. It's going to take months. It might be years. So you can't expect a fast turnaround, or you're just going to set yourself up for disappointment. At Mount Sinai, for any tech solution, any application that anyone wants to bring in from a vendor, there's an application steering group, the committee of maybe 20 people, maybe half of them in IT, half of them leadership from other places in the organization. And that group is kind of the first gate that the person who wants to bring in a new application from a vendor has to get approval from before they can move forward. So there's a form that they fill out. What's the vendor? What's the service? What are the terms? What's the cost? And they'll go to that committee and they'll present what is this service and the vendor that they want to purchase. The committee members may have questions for them, right? Maybe about data security. A common question is if the health system is already contracted with a vendor who provides something similar, they may get asked, why can't you use this other vendor that we already work with? So if the champion can effectively address whatever questions come up, that committee will sign off and they'll move forward. If the champion doesn't have the answers, then they're going to have to go back to the vendor, figure out the answers, and then re-present at the next meeting of that committee, which is, I think, 2 weeks later. So you can see how things can start to take a while. So once that committee signs off, then we move on to the procurement department. And the procurement department is sort of in the middle of the process for getting the approvals to move forward with the vendor. So they work closely with cybersecurity as well as with legal to make sure everyone has signed off before we move forward with the contract. So legal is, of course, responsible for the legal agreements. So that would be the BAA and the master services arrangement. Sorry, the master services agreement. And as I discussed at the beginning, because health systems have been around for a long time, they have established processes, they're going to have templates for all of those standard legal agreements. And they will have been using those templates for many years, and they're not going to want to deviate from those templates. So the advice here, you may, as a startup, as a tech company, you probably have your own templates. You're going to want to defer to the health system, work off of theirs, and make whatever edits you need rather than asking them to work off of yours. Because remember, one of the implications of the size of the organization is that getting your contract across the finish line may be a priority for your champion, but it's probably not a priority for the corporate lawyer who's responsible for negotiating the legal agreements. So that's that piece. And then there's also the cybersecurity team. So they'll have a questionnaire that asks about how do you store your data? How do you protect the data? Do you have certifications like SOC 2 or HITRUST? And they'll need to sign off as well. So once there's agreement on the legal documents as well as cybersecurity sign off, then the contract will move forward into, we call it the signature portal at Mount Sinai. And that's where it has to be signed off electronically by different people in the organization. And so who needs to approve it depends on the total dollar amount of the contract. At Mount Sinai, if it's less than $100,000, then it can be approved at the director level. If it's between $100,000 and $500,000, it has to go up to the VP level. And over $500,000, it has to get signed off on by the chief information officer. So you can imagine if you've got a high dollar contract, the chief information officer is on vacation, right? Again, you get these delays because of all of those folks who have to sign off. So yeah, that's the process. Once those people sign off, then you can move forward with implementation.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a really helpful overview. I agree. Using the health systems paper and redlining only the areas that are actually material to your company helps a lot with saving time. But it's also really clear there's a lot of stakeholders that impact the buying process. Joe, how does what Rachel shared compare with what you've experienced?
Well, this definitely echoes my experience. You're dealing with long sales cycles, right? And then sometimes to get the contracts fully executed, that can take a while too. And as Rachel mentioned, it can take years. And so I think startups should be prepared for this. Companies should be prepared for this process because that's sort of the way it works. And quick story, one of my best sales over the years was a contract that took about 3 years, which is a very long time. But it initially started, the company that I worked for at the time, we were a secondary vendor for a health system, and we were providing great service. And the opportunity to bid to kind of increase our market share and have the majority of their business came up. And we put in a proposal, and I think it was well received, but there were some really strong points that we were missing. And the health system gave us some great feedback on what we could do better next time. And we really took that and ran with it. And we were able to improve our proposal and to build a solid case a few years later and ultimately earn their business. But in the meantime, there was a million things that we did to maintain the relationship, to demonstrate that we're capable and trustworthy and that they could really rely on our organization. And to do that, we were sharing reports regularly, continue meeting with them quarterly, going over the business reviews. And that really built a solid foundation where they were able to kind of move into the next step with us. And so it can take time. So my advice is to be prepared for that and don't be discouraged because it ultimately is worth it in the end. And if you get your foot in the door, even for a small implementation, this is really critical. It opens up opportunities for you later. So my recommendation is to be open to that as well, because you never know where that could lead you. And if the system Sometimes the health systems will let you use their name so that you can mention that they're a customer, because invariably when you're meeting with other health systems, they'll ask you, oh, who else are you working with? And it's great to be able to list a few names, especially if they're well known. So this could be really helpful. So remember to ask for that. I think it's something it's easy to overlook when you're with everything that's happening, but it is important in the long run. And finally, uh, for early stage companies especially, getting your foot in the door with the health system will allow you to build data, to build case studies, to present data to your other customers, and in the long run, to build a stronger proposal for other prospective customers. So, and it extends your runway, of course. So these are all great things to keep in mind. So even the small implementations are worth going for.
Got it. Well, in other words, it sounds like building that longer term value added relationship pays dividends, right? So once a company is in, Rachel, what tips would you offer on keeping that health systems business?
Sure. And these are just sort of basic tips on being a professional vendor. So I would say be responsive to requests, right? If they send an email and ask for something, even if you can't get them what they want right away, at least acknowledge it so they know you're working on it. Um, Communicate proactively. I've had instances where we had a weekly meeting with the vendor, and the vendor would wait until that meeting to let us know that they had run into an issue or had faced a barrier. Don't do that, right? Once you run into something, proactively reach out. And then similarly, be sure to inform your client if there's PTO coming up. If you've got folks in a different country with different holidays, let them know if people are going to be out for those types of things. Yeah, those are some of the tips.
Got it. Joe, do you have anything to add?
Sure, yeah, I think promptly responding to your customers is really important. And this is something that, Rachel mentioned that I think is a lot of vendors seem to overlook this. And one of my previous roles, our manager was really dedicated to responding to all customer inquiries within 24 hours. So that was the standard. Even if we didn't have the exact answer, we could always say, "Hey, we're looking into that and we will get back to you soon." Or, oh, you know what? That's a great question. I'll connect you with the subject matter expert that could help you. And maybe that was a medical director, maybe that was someone else within the company that could help the customer. But really being responsive and making that part of your process is really going to move you forward. And I've seen companies that have overlooked this, and the customers tend to remember this when renewals come around, and it's one of those things that could cause problems down the road. So be aware of that and recognize that it's easy to get behind. So make sure to stay on top of those inquiries as they come in.
I would also add that we had talked before about being flexible and, if the health system has their own template for something, defer to them and use their template. That applies also to communication norms and tools. So if you're at a startup, there's a good chance you use Slack for your daily communication. I guarantee you, your hospital client does not, right? They're probably on Teams, maybe they're using email. And, that's probably not your preference for how to collaborate, but I would encourage you to be flexible, have them credential you with Teams, get in there and be, communicating with whatever is the medium that's their preference.
Thank you, Rachel and Joe. So it sounds like proactively communicating, right, or being responsive, just generally being easy to work with. These are the themes that I'm really hearing from the both of you, and they resonate with me actually. Rachel, let's continue with you. Are there any stories that you can share about companies or people you've interacted with that maybe made some mistakes that others should avoid?
Yes, and this will be all anonymous. So this is a new one from the last 2 weeks. I actually had two different vendors reach out to me simultaneously on LinkedIn and in my work email. So I get two messages from the same person. I mentioned that I prefer to engage on LinkedIn. So in both cases, I engaged with the person on LinkedIn. We had a conversation. In one case, we set a time for a call. In the other case, we decided that no further conversation was needed. And then both of them sent me a follow up to the email, which is not where we had had the conversation. And that follow up was sent as though we had not engaged on LinkedIn. So by doing that, they basically undid all of the goodwill and the positive relationship that we had built on LinkedIn because they just had a bot follow up with me to the email. So my advice again, is to, first follow someone on LinkedIn, see if you can engage with their activity there, then reach out to them on LinkedIn. If that doesn't work, right, maybe they're just not active on LinkedIn, then by all means, send an email to their work account, but don't send both at once. Can you imagine, right, if one of your coworkers simultaneously sent you an email, called you on the phone, and sent you a text, right? It's annoying. You feel bombarded. So don't do that to your prospects. Another example, there was a business development rep who reached out to me wanting to talk about something that they wanted to sell to Mount Sinai. And I said, I'd be happy to take a look and give some feedback, but want you to know I'm leaving the health system soon. They said, oh, okay, never mind. And then came back 2 days later and wanted to know if I could refer them to someone else in the health system, which no, I'm not going to do that if I haven't even met them or seen their solution, right? So they should have taken my initial offer to chat, because if they had impressed me, maybe I would have made that connection. There was another time I was working to get a vendor approved, right, through that whole gauntlet of approvals. And they were not following Joe's and my advice to defer to the health system on their norms. So, for example, we were looking to put a BAA in place with them, which is pretty standard. And for some reason, they wanted to, instead of having the BAA be between Mount Sinai and their company, they suggested that we put in place individual BAAs with each of their individual contractors who are going to be doing software development for us, which would have been unwieldy, impractical, right? So then if there's a problem, we have to sue an individual contractor. And this really reduced their credibility in the eyes of our legal department and our procurement department, right? The lawyer and the procurement person were like, are these amateurs? It was just such a bizarre suggestion that didn't make any sense from our perspective. And that didn't end up being the straw that broke the camel's back. But then when there was another mismatch where we needed a certain amount of insurance and they didn't have as much, the legal and the procurement guys were like, you know what, we're done. We're not working with these folks anymore, right? It sort of made them impatient and made it easy for them to say, we're ready to walk away instead of continuing the negotiations. And then last example, I had an instance where a business development rep reached out, did a good job, asked me if I would get on a call and see a demo. I said, sure. I got on the call, and then he wasn't the one presenting. He brought some more senior account executive or someone to talk about the product. And the guy got on, he didn't have a deck. He didn't have a demo. He just sort of talked to me about the solution, which seemed, it didn't impress me from a professionalism perspective. It seemed kind of lazy. And it also made it difficult for me to really understand what they were offering, right? Because there was nothing for me to look at. Halfway through the presentation, he asked me what EHR Mount Sinai used, right? Which also showed that he hadn't put even 30 seconds of preparation in. And so I felt like that was an instance where I went in with a positive attitude and then was just kind of disappointed and didn't end up moving forward with them.
Thank you. Got it. So some common themes again, right? Don't turn down conversations, be easy to work with, come into conversations informed and prepared. And I guess yikes about the BAA, multiple BAAs, and not doing the quick Google search on Mount Sinai EHR, which could have yielded some fruitful results. Now, how about examples of companies that have stood out to you for doing things well?
Yeah. So there was one business development rep who I had done a LinkedIn post where I had shared some tips on trying to sell to health systems, right? Some of the same content we're talking about today. And he responded to that post. I think he left a comment or he liked it or something. And so I had his name kind of top of mind. Then he reached out with a connection request, sent me a message telling me how helpful my tips were. And then he asked if I would be willing to get on a call and look at a demo of their product. So that was really good, right? It was sort of a slow escalation of building that relationship and building that affinity instead of diving right into the ask and the sale. And then there was another company that reached out and they asked if I would be interested in being a panelist on an all-day webinar that they were hosting on digital front doors to health systems. And I thought that was so smart, right? Because it first of all, it flatters me, right? And that's kind of the common thread between these two examples, but it pulls me in to get involved with them. And again, it builds sort of the foundation of a relationship and gives me a positive view of them before they go into selling. So I think that's an important takeaway. If you can, when you're reaching out to the person, if you can find something about them to compliment, to flatter, right? Whether that's saying, oh, I see you have a lot of experience in this area, would love to get your feedback, or whether that's asking them to participate in an event that you're putting on, that will make people feel more positively and more warmly to you, and be more likely to be open to hearing what you're selling.
Thank you, Rachel. And just a friendly reminder, I see one question came into the queue. Feel free to drop in a few more because we will be touching on those at the end. Now, there's always a lot going on in the healthcare industry, especially these days. So, Joe, how do you stay up to date on the latest news, the market trends, the latest developments, and how does that inform your sales approach?
It's a great question. And I think this is really important. I make it a priority to attend webinars, to listen to podcasts that are relevant to my field, and also to attend especially local and statewide events in the particular fields that I'm focused on. So just to give an example, as I mentioned, working with the pharmacy company, I just attended an event in upstate New York and New Jersey in the last few weeks. And there, if there's events in your area that are easy to go to, great way to meet people in person and to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in your industry. In addition, if you're also going to the national events, but that's one recommendation. And I find that sharing the information that you can glean from all these sources is really valuable, and you're adding value to what you can bring to your customers. So, for example, if I have a conversation with one of my customers and they happen to reference a particular topic, if I see a webinar on that or a podcast or an article or a story that is relevant to that, I'll make sure to send it to them along with a personalized note. And if that doesn't come up organically, generally what I try to do is at least once a month to find something that I think is really compelling or interesting and send that out to my customers along with a note. And this is a great way to stay in touch with them. And what I like about this approach is you're not always asking them for something. You're leading with value and you're giving them something that is useful to them in their job. Maybe it's helping them, and they'll remember that, and they'll say, wow, this is great. So I think this is something that will help you stand above uh, many other of the sales reps out there, I think, if you could do this on a regular basis.
Yeah, and it's really like you're building a relationship, really. Some great tips. I'd love to actually hear a story from you as well, Joe. So, can you share an example of a particularly challenging sale that you made to a health system and were able to successfully close?
Yes, this is early on in my career. I had an opportunity to expand the service area of the company I was working for. So we were traditionally limited to the greater New York City area, but I saw opportunity to expand way up into upstate New York and started calling health systems up there. And, the first few that I spoke to were very skeptical. They'd never worked with us before. We were new to the area. But then I finally found one that was expressed a little bit of interest, and I said, "Great, can we book a meeting? I'd love to come up and meet with you and present our solutions and see if there's any opportunities for collaboration." And sure enough, there was. We were able to identify some pain points that I thought we could help the customer with, but I had to do a little bit of legwork and come up with a novel solution to do so. So there's a few things that are important here in this story. Number one is we have to build that relationship that's critical, as you mentioned, Lena, and building trust. So there was some skepticism about our services because the health system was not familiar with us. They never worked with someone for this particular service outside of their area, and it was entirely new. And so they said, "Wait, we think you could help us, but we're not quite sure." So what I came up with was a solution for a 6-month agreement, a 6-month term, where they had the opportunity to leave if it wasn't working. And I said, and then if you're happy, we could always extend it from there, go into a normal 1-year term. And eventually they agreed to that. And we did the initial 6 months. Everything went really well. It was smooth. And then they re-signed for another year. And as over time, we built that relationship, and eventually they went to a 3-year term. So I think there's opportunities to identify those pain points, or identify the obstacles, and come up with novel solutions. And that's one way, is by making it risk-free for your customer. Maybe not risk-free. There's some risk involved with everything, but to make it easier for them. And this goes back to another theme of just being easy to work with. And so we were able to, the thing that's interesting about this is we were able to leverage that one partnership, because immediately thereafter, a number of other hospitals in the region started to reach out to us saying, "Oh, we heard you're working with this health system." So word kind of spreads. If you're offering good product and service, and you're helping your customers, believe me, they'll speak to their peers and let them know. So this is a great way to organically grow your company, and that to me, that was a really instructive experience.
Wonderful. Those are some great tips and a great story as well. Well, we've reached the Q&A portion of our conversation. So we'll start with some of the terrific questions that were sent in. I see a second question came in live, so folks, feel free to keep adding those to the queue because we'll try to answer those as well. All right, so let's start with some tactical ones. Other than LinkedIn, are there other channels to reach health system leaders? Joe, let's start with you.
Sure. A little bit less effective than LinkedIn, but important nonetheless, is Health Tech Nerds is a Slack community, which I've personally found useful. There may be other Slack communities that are relevant to your discipline worth looking into. And I also think a webinar is a great way, especially if you have case studies or data that you want to present. And if your company is at the cutting edge of your particular discipline, this could be a great way to reach a much larger audience. That I had done this originally with the startup that I worked for, after getting on several sales calls with our medical director with health systems around the country. And he had to present this data all day. So eventually we had the idea, like, why don't we just make this into a webinar and we can get a much wider audience? Then the content is available on demand. So now you have resources and information you could share with your customers proactively. This may anticipate some of the objections that come up. So these are really good, and I think inexpensive ways to market your product or service. Also, not maybe not as easy to do as the webinar, but I did mention the going to the local and statewide events to start with that are unique to your discipline, and Rachel is also an advocate for that as well. I think that's a great way to meet the clinical users who you ultimately want to build those relationships with.
Yeah, I would echo webinars as a good strategy, whether you're attending ones that someone else is putting on and just seeing who else is there. I've noticed that it's sort of socially acceptable, even if you haven't interacted directly with someone else who's on the webinar, to send a connection request on LinkedIn and say, "Hey, I see you're also on this webinar, would love to connect," right? And then that kind of lowers the barrier to reach out further. And then one of the advantages of offering your own webinars is it can be a lower barrier for folks from a health system to join those versus committing to what's essentially a pitch call. So I've, over the last 6 weeks, I've been trying to help a friend of mine who's at a startup who's looking to do some demos at Mount Sinai. I've been reaching out to folks in the health system and trying to get them to look at a demo. And I've seen this culture of consensus at work where each person says, "Oh, I need to check with this other person first." And then they say, "Oh, maybe, but I need to check with this other person first." And from my perspective, getting on a call with a vendor and watching a demo, like, it's not a big investment, right? It's half an hour, and that would probably be faster than all of these email chains. But the culture is often that people feel like, "Oh, I'm not the decision maker. I'm not allowed to do that. I have to ask permission first." I feel like for those people to join a webinar, right, an educational opportunity, they probably don't have that same voice saying, like, "Oh, this isn't your job. You're not allowed to do that." So it might be an easier way to get in front of some of those users who may not feel empowered to get on like a formal vendor conversation.
Great tips. Yeah, a great way to add value and build a connection. All right, well, we'll go to the next one. This one was, this person would love to understand how much variability there is between health systems and their needs. So this is funny because Rachel and I were debating this a little bit based on our experiences. So I'll kick us off, and Rachel, feel free to layer on kind of your perspective too. I think when you talk to any health system, they'll probably express a lot of the similar pressures. They're dealing with a lot of similar pressures, like Rachel had said earlier, right? They have lower margins relative to other industries. They're experiencing increased competition. There's inflationary pressures. So, for example, they're rising wages due to labor shortages, and then these same shortages are leading to burnout and turnover. But I think what's interesting to just kind of sit back and think about is not all health systems look the same, and they don't all experience those same pressures the same way. In some ways, it might be more heightened. So it's important to just do some research on who you're selling to. So other than some some of the more obvious things, like how many beds a hospital has, or if they're a teaching hospital or a children's hospital, I'm just going to highlight a few other considerations to go a layer deeper. So, in terms of number one, payer mix. So community hospitals and safety net hospitals may have a higher proportion of Medicaid and Medicare or uninsured mix of patients. So for that reason, they may be even more focused on operational efficiency and less likely to have discretionary cash or budget to invest in new programs or innovation or to build out a venture capital arm versus hospitals with more, or health systems with a greater commercial mix. So that's just something to think about. The second thing that I would look into is just the overall competitive landscape. Do you understand, and it may or may not be relevant to your product, but do you understand what services they offer? What service lines? Are they uniquely positioned? Are there gaps? Who are their competitors? What's their market share? When Rachel and I were talking about this, she made an excellent point about how health systems in areas with greater competition, think about New York, for example, and how many health systems it has, may be more receptive to solutions that attract patients versus those in regions that have limited competition, who may be more interested upfront about cost savings or operational efficiencies or how to serve patients with their limited resources. The third thing I think about is how these health systems may or may not have diversified their revenue. We often talk about health systems as if they're just hospitals, but a lot of those pressures we mentioned earlier, particularly from competitors, some of those health systems have responded to those pressures in different varying degrees. So, think about the ambulatory side, ambulatory surgery centers, urgent care centers. Do they have a specialty pharmacy? Have they entered into other parts of the care continuum? Have they started to really take an increased focus on value-based care? It's just really important to understand where the health system is on that journey. The fourth thing that I would think about is their operational or technology infrastructure. So for example, the level of technology investment or integration between different systems can vary. If your company integrates with a specific EHR, maybe you want to focus on health systems that use that EHR, or maybe you need to create some more integrations. Other things to think about, are there a lot of manual processes? Maybe you need to take that into consideration as you develop and pilot your solution and implement it. Certain teams may be in certain organizations more centralized, and they might report to different parts of the organization. Those are just some things that, you may find some of that info online, but are likely things you'll learn through conversations with individuals at the health system. Rachel, anything else you'd highlight as important?
Yeah, one other element I would think about, especially if you're implementing a solution that's going to be part of care delivery, is the number of sites that a health system has. So if you're implementing a revenue cycle solution, even if a hospital has 5 sites, they probably just have one revenue cycle department, so it doesn't really matter. But if you're implementing a solution that's going to be put in the ED, like for patient triage or intake or something like that, and a health system has 5 different sites and they all have different EDs, that's going to be a little bit more complicated to make that sale versus selling to a single site health system. On the flip side, a larger health system with more EDs, that's going to be a larger contract if you can get it. So maybe there's an opportunity to do a pilot in one of the EDs and potentially expand, right? So there's considerations on both sides.
That makes a lot of sense. Spot on. All right, let's go to the last question that we had sent in previously, and then we'll turn into what's coming into the queue. So just a friendly reminder, add a few more, and we have had 2 come in so far. So this one, we'll start, Joe, with you and then go to Rachel. So how can you convert an unpaid pilot to a paid customer? That's a really good question.
Great question. You know, it's funny that we got this question because last week I was working on this very issue. So in a conversation with the health system, with one of my clients, we presented a service proposal, and they thought it was great. And like, oh, and by the way, can we also try a pilot project to get started? And so we had to go back and we had to pivot and think about, okay, what's a fair way to do this? Because, you know, with this particular company, we're just getting started, and we want to introduce our solution to the market. And one of the compromises that we came up with is like, yeah, I think that's reasonable because it will take about 6 months or so for the health system to generate enough data and to really have a case study and see if this is a great fit for them or not. And so we want to be flexible. We want to be easy to work with, just to go back to the themes that we've discussed previously. So we came up with an offer where we said, okay, here's what we could do. We could offer you the service for 6 months. And then if you're happy with it, great. You don't need to do anything else. It'll automatically renew, and the regular service agreement will kick in, at which point the health system will be billed, on a monthly basis for the service. And so I think that's a good compromise because it makes it smooth. It's seamless. If they're happy with the service, great. They don't need to do anything. If there's concerns, we can have a conversation, but it makes it easier for them to move forward, and without having to go back to contracting and all the work that entails, as Rachel mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Rachel, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, so I would advise if you're going to do a pilot, and especially if it's unpaid, then your goal is to convert it to being a paid engagement. You want to ask the customer, what do you need to see from this pilot in order for you to decide to convert to a paid engagement, right? Have them define what are the metrics and what are the targets, because then that makes it really clear to you what you're shooting for, and there's no ambiguity as to what's important. And if you hit those goals that they've set out for you, it's going to be much more hard for them to say, oh, no, we don't really feel it, right? Because they define success. So that's one piece. You want to make sure that you're able to collect baselines for whatever the metrics are that you're tracking, so that you can clearly show the change. And yeah, it's really about demonstrating the impact. And then I would also say one of the processes that I put in place at the Consumer Digital Innovations team at Mount Sinai was a statement of work at the beginning of an implementation. And part of what's in there is what are we going to provide as, the team that's built the platform. But then it's also what is the customer going to provide? What are they committing to? And so that could be a risk with pilot, right? One of the reasons a pilot might fail is not because your technology doesn't work, but if the customer isn't adequately engaged, isn't giving you, enough time or enough attention. And so I would advise, especially if you're doing an unpaid pilot, you need to make sure that they're committing to whatever it is you need them to do, whether that's weekly meetings or having someone carve out 20% of their time, because you don't want to put a bunch of time and effort into a pilot only to have it fail because the customer wasn't engaged.
Those are some great tips. All right. Well, we'll move to the couple of questions that came in. So we've got one about how does this sales cycle differ when offering consulting type services?
So I haven't brought in consultants personally. So I haven't seen this happen, but my guess is that it's probably a shorter sales cycle. The reason is that they're not going to have to go through the application steering committee group, right? There's no technology. And then they're also not going to they're not going to have to be evaluated by cybersecurity. So yeah, there's a couple steps that don't need to happen. Um, Consulting is also the type of thing where often the amount that a health system will be spending on them may be more variable than with a technology implementation, right? So you could have consultants come in and charge you a certain amount per week or per month. And if it's not working, you can stop at any time. Versus with a technology implementation, you can't like do it halfway. You don't get any value out of that. So bringing in consultants is a little less risky from that perspective too.
Joe, anything from your perspective to share on that, or?
No, I think that covers it really well. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just share from my experience at one of the health systems that I was in. We did bring in a consultant, but I think also, just to layer on to what Rachel shared, I agree it's probably a shorter sales cycle, and it also matters the urgency, perhaps, of the type of consulting work that is being done. So, we were trying to drive operational efficiency across the health system, and that moved pretty quickly. It was at an executive level to get that to closure in terms of contracting, et cetera. All right, we'll go to the next question. What is the order of magnitude of ROI that you need to demonstrate to get a health system's attention? Does this differ between departments and specialties? That's a really good one. Rachel, let's perhaps start with you.
So I don't have a lot of data to pull in here, but I'll just sort of give, my gut reaction to this. I would say probably at a minimum, if a health system is going to spend $1, they need to be saving $2. Ideally, they're spending $1, they're saving 5 or 10, right? That's more compelling. But I think if it's less than 1 to 2, it may not be kind of worth the squeeze. I would say the place that differs between departments and specialties is really about like what's the total pot of money that we're talking about here, right? So if it's a solution, right? If you look at a hospital's budget, if you're attacking a cost area that's a large portion of their budget, then maybe you don't need to demonstrate as much savings for that to be valuable because it's going to be tens of millions of dollars, even if you're saving a smaller percent. On the other hand, if you have a very tailored solution and it's just for this one, you're replacing this one particular type of equipment that's used in this one particular specialty, then the ultimate bottom line is not going to be as high. And so that might be harder to get them to move on without having a higher ratio of that ROI.
That makes a lot of sense. Joe, anything from your perspective?
Sure. My gut is telling me that if you have a solution that will help ease the burden of staffing shortages or other critical needs, let's say there's supply shortages within the organization, that the savings may not necessarily need to be as substantial, or the ROI, if it really addresses this strong issue, like especially if it's impacting patient care. So I think it really depends on the service that you're offering, but there's a lot of different pathways there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So thinking about kind of, is this something that was budgeted, was part of the budget expected to be? Is it a replacement item versus something net new working within this confines of the same budget? It should likely generate some form of ROI and perhaps some sort of solve some sort of pain point, to your point, Joe. All right. Folks, just a reminder to add some more questions if you have any. We actually did receive another one earlier on that I'd love to dig into there. So one person asked, what are requirements that health systems have of vendors, specifically insurance? So this is something that is a little specific in terms of, how each health system approaches it. But generally speaking, if you're not sure what kind of insurance to have on hand for your contract to be able to execute those contracts, go to that health system's website. A lot of times they have things like vendor policies on a supply chain oriented or vendor specific part of their website. And you can click, if it's not clear from looking around and if they don't have insurance terms clearly outlined, just click on their standard purchase order terms. It'll give you a starting point, if nothing else, before you engage in a conversation with their procurement team. But worst case, ask, the person that champion you're working with and ultimately procurement as you go through the contract. But just a couple of notes that I had here for myself. Generally speaking, general liability seems to hover around 1 to 2 million. Workers' comp, I hope you have that, is likely standard. But the things that might start to vary are cyber insurance. So, I've seen one health system have 1 million as their minimum, but that's probably just trying to address lots of different types of vendors that don't necessarily have tech solutions. They could be medical device type vendors, right? I've seen 10 million as a requirement. Likely that type of requirement is negotiable. Errors and omission, 2 to 5 million. But again, just go to their website to see what they say and ultimately talk to them as you engage in the contract. All right, we've actually had another question come in. If a potential consultant is a licensed clinical contributor, so for example, an MD, PA, NP, RN, might this allow easier access approval if this consultant is onboarded, credentialed like a standard employee?
Maybe. I mean, it depends on the type of work that they're going to be doing. If they're just going to be a contractor, that can happen pretty easily. And I've actually seen at health systems, sometimes departments seem to prefer to hire contractors instead of full-time employees because it's a different line item in their budget, and it's easier to get approval to hire contractors than full-time employees, because full-time employees, you have to assume that cost goes on in perpetuity, whereas with a contractor, it's more flexible. So yeah, if it's a single person that's going to basically augment the workforce, then yeah, that is going to be easier to get approval for than a larger contract with a vendor.
Got it. All right, keep those questions coming in. Well, actually, no, we're out of time. We're at the last minute. So, any parting thoughts, Rachel or Joe?
Yeah, I know we've talked a lot about how hard, how onerous it is to sell to health systems. And I would just say that if you can make it through that process, it can be really worth it at the end. Because it is so hard to get in, that means that once you're the incumbent, you will become basically the default choice for the health system. So on the project I'm doing right now, where we're replacing the homegrown patient engagement platform with vendor solutions, the team did not even evaluate different vendor solutions for the chat component of what we needed to build. It was just because Avama was already used by other parts of the health system, they were just the default. And so I would encourage you to, if you can, try to put the resources into making that sale, because then it's really yours to lose.
Got it. Joe, anything from your perspective?
Yes, definitely want to close this on a positive note, and I agree totally that incumbency is a powerful force. So once you're in, the tendency is to stay in there. So it really is a game that requires patience and dedication over time. It doesn't happen as quickly as we like sometimes, but I think it certainly rewards those efforts. And would like to close by saying it's always great to have your customers be your advocates. So ask for referrals, ask for connections, tap into your network and go from there.
Perfect. Let's end on that positive note. So just a quick reminder or note here, we'll plan on emailing the recording in about a week. And in the meantime, feel free to connect via LinkedIn with either Rachel, Joe, or myself if you have any other questions. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.